Chapter 2. Diplomacy. A massive crowd had gathered at Eridan's East Gate, which was actually a series of 4 gates that spanned the little willow bar, to witness the arrival of King Cragmere, who ruled the neighboring kingdom of North Calas from the palace of the Golden Dome in the city of Garban. Citizens were dressed in their best, ready to give a warm welcome to their allies in appreciation of the Calasians' efforts alongside the soldiers of Crysin at the Split. Vendors offered everything from food and drink to books that chronicled the adventures of the famous knights of North Calas. Street artists worked their canvases, creating colorful depictions of valorous acts relayed by eyewitnesses or sprung from rumors of what had happened on the Day of Darkness. A few of them were even accurate. Another year of freedom had been bought with the blood and sweat of the combined nations of Alnorda, and the celebration of their victory had been ongoing since King Urion had returned with his troops 3 days prior. One face did not reflect the excitement of those around him. Jaden had been instructed by Madame Lowry to bathe as quickly as he could and dress in the formal clothes she had personally laid out for him, featuring a black silk shirt emblazoned with the Ryanthorn crown in silver tipped with red flame, before being escorted by the same royal guardsman who had recovered him to Convergence Square to await the arrival of Cragmere and his daughter, Princess Carolel. His mother and father were already waiting on the polished wooden platform that had been erected just for the joyous occasion. Tactfully, they made no comment on his late arrival, though the look on his father's face spoke volumes. Aside from the royal guard stationed in neat rows to the rear and either side of them, the ruling family was accompanied by Eckenroy, Grisland, and Governor Fortinbrow, who oversaw Crysin's western province. The governor was a tall, thin man who always seemed to be looking down at people disapprovingly over his long, pointy nose. His hair, more gray than black, though he was not an old man, was nearly always pulled back into one long tail. Luckily, his visits to Eridan never lasted more than a week or so. It was no secret that Urion despised the man, his attitude, and his politics, and had told him so to his face more than once where curious ears had overheard. Rumor held that if Fortinbrow was in Eridan, it was a good time to avoid the king altogether. This week was an exception, however. No one could be too irritable after another victory at the Split. Jaden's mother tousled his hair and smiled. He wished she wouldn't do that where people could see, but he did not want to hurt her feelings, so he kept quiet and tolerated it. At least she was not conspiring to force him into marriage to a girl with whom he had nothing in common. She would never plot behind his back. Her Royal Majesty, Queen Jocelyn Ryanthorn, had a reputation as a kind, honest, nurturing soul, and it was no exaggeration. Jaden had rarely seen her angry, though he knew he had given her plenty of cause to be through the years. Her hair was a shimmering honey blonde, and her complexion was widely said to be the fairest in the kingdom, though people did tend to sensationalize the beauty of queens. She wore a simpler crown than her husband, if more elegant, with silver wire wrapped in flowing knots and a single, sparkling sapphire set in the front. Pointed features gave her a slightly exotic look that she had passed on to him, in part. She was tall for a woman, and it still surprised him that he found himself looking down at her since his last growth spurt. Affording her a stealthy peck on the side of the head he hoped no one would notice, he quickly resumed the proper regal posture Madame Lowry insisted he display during public appearances. The sight of Matthias nearby in the crowd almost forced a crack in his well-composed exterior. His friend had apparently gotten hold of some sort of pastry filled with jam and managed to smear the seeded red innards over a good portion of his face. Seeing that Jaden was looking his way and trying with great effort to appear dignified, he did what any good friend would have done and stuck his tongue out while crossing his eyes and wiggling his fingers at the sides of his head. The action, and even more so the fact that Matthias almost certainly had no idea that his face was covered in jam, was so comical it was nearly impossible for Jaden to maintain a straight face. Eckenroy noticed the exchange and eyed them both as if he thought they would attempt a dramatic escape down the willow bar at any moment. That was out of the question now, of course, with the royal guard sure to be watching his every move. It looked as though he would have to do his duty and be at the beck and call of the princess for a few days. It might not turn out to be as bad as he was dreading, he supposed. She really was very pretty. Perhaps her disposition had softened since their last encounter, or perhaps she would at least be less imperious away from her father's court, where her words were next to law and her slightest gesture could command an entire army of servants. Trumpet blasts and cheers greeted the aged king of North Calas as he crossed the bridge over the east fork of the Little Willowbar River with his extensive retinue in tow, including a royal blue coach pulled by 4 chestnut mares. It was easy to imagine Carolel inside, her slender frame perfectly erect, bored and unimpressed by all of the rabble who had come just to catch a glimpse of her. Foreign rabble, as the princess generally referred to commoners who were not of her homeland, would be particularly beneath her notice. The nobility of North Calas was famously snobbish, and he had always felt that Carolel perfectly embodied that spirit. With an effort, he told himself to follow Matthias's advice and keep an open mind about her, at least until she said or did something so outrageous or condescending that he could no longer contain himself and was forced to escape her presence or explode. Her oldest brother, Prince Merklin, conspicuously absent from his father's side, was at least on par with his sister in arrogance. He murmured a quick thank you to the thoughts that the prince did not appear to have made the trip. Following the royal line and their entourage of courtiers came the knights of North Calas, clad from helm to foot in gleaming plate-mail armor with squires proudly bearing the pennants of their houses. The people threw flowers in their wake, honoring an ancient Calasian custom. Eckenroy, Jaden noticed, watched the procession with his typically stoic expression. Crysin's general and first man-at-arms had once been the most famous of all Cragmere's knights, and if not for a mysterious falling out with the king, he would most likely have been leading the column. After his quarrel with the notoriously temperamental monarch, the man had disappeared for a while, finally resurfacing in Eridan to offer his services to Urion. The accounts of his whereabouts between the two periods were hazy, and the famed warrior refused to speak of those days in passing. One rumor claimed that he had become champion to a wizard, but that was difficult to believe since he served Crysin now. Wizard's champion was not a position that one left willingly, or by any means other than death if the stories were to be believed. He was certainly no champion to Grisland, the only member of the Brotherhood Jaden had ever known. The two of them were civil to each other in public, for the king's sake, but the taciturn general could not conceal a little sneer when the white-robed conjurer's name was mentioned in passing. As Cragmere's black war-horse came to a halt before them, Madame Lowry subtly cleared her throat and motioned toward the man with her head. Then Jaden remembered his instructions. Stepping forward, he bowed deeply and held aloft the priceless bejeweled dagger with silver inlay he had been toying with in his pocket for the last 10 minutes, offering it to the king. "Welcome to Eridan, your majesty," he said in a neutral tone. "On behalf of my family and all of Crysin, I present you with the dagger of my ancestor, Arden Ryanthorn." There was more he had been instructed to say, but nothing he felt was important, so he hadn't bothered to memorize it all. He would probably hear about that from the headmistress later. Cragmere received the dagger with a little smile that bordered on a smirk and held it up to the light, the blade gleaming like steel fresh from the forge even after hundreds of years. "A pretty thing. It will look very nice in my treasury next to the other baubles. I do not suppose it has been bewitched to spout flame or some such trickery." A few of his nearby servants snickered, but others who heard the comment looked about nervously. Crysin was widely regarded as an odd kingdom by the standards of most of the other nations of Alnorda, owing to the University of Internal Mending and the presence of a wizard in Urion's circle of advisors. Magic was something that was difficult for many people to come to terms with. Nature had laws, and many felt that magic circumvented those laws to the detriment of society. It was magic, after all, wielded by an ancient king that had opened the gateway to the demon world. But it was also magic that had created the split, which now helped protect them all from the threat. Personally, Jaden felt that Crysin was not that different from any other kingdom. After all, many of the other nations' leaders had a personal mender, even if they did not advertise the fact. And that mender was almost always from the university in Eridan. It was also not uncommon for wizards to have extended stays at any court in Alnorda. What ruler would dare deny them, after all? A more meaningful throat-clearing escaped from Madame Lowry. "Furthermore," Jaden intoned reluctantly, "I ask permission to act as escort to Her Highness, Princess Carolel, during her stay with us." That part he had not needed to memorize, though it was what he would have liked most to forget. At least he had managed not to sigh before saying it out loud this time. Well, There might have been a hint of one. "Another pretty thing," Cragmire murmured slyly. The conspiratorial look he shared with Urion made Jaden feel like a puppet moving to the pull of the older men's strings. "Permission granted," declared the king. The look he gave Jaden then made him feel more like a horse being sized up by a potential buyer. "Broad shoulders, a proud bearing, strong jawline, not much hair on your chin, but that will come in time. You have filled out into a fine young princeling over the last few years, haven't you?" Jaden did not trust his tongue at that moment, so he saw fit not to use it. "Should the two of you find yourselves on common ground," the musing monarch continued, "you have my sincere blessing to woo her, if you can." He chuckled when Jaden's eyebrows shot up. "Courting is for children, and the two of you are already well enough acquainted. We are not so prudish about such things in Garban, though the ignorant backwoods country folk in the surrounding villages may feel differently. I know what goes through a young man's mind when he gazes on my daughter, and who can blame him? You are both of an age to marry, so I will not prance around the issue like some gelding being put through his paces. The two of you would produce a fine, strapping brood. Our kingdoms have long been on the brink of a strong alliance. For 200 years, since the end of the Illusion Wars, to be exact. Such a union would benefit us all." "Your Majesty is too kind," Jaden stammered, his thoughts far less grateful than his words. Had the man really mentioned marriage in front of the thoughts and everyone? It was enough to make his head swim. Their scheming had gone farther than he could have imagined. Did they look at the union as a given? How soon did they expect this to happen? Had they already set a date? "I come bearing a gift as well," Cragmire announced mysteriously. The king motioned, and a beady-eyed servant with straight hair that hung stiffly down to his neckline made his way woodenly forward to stand in front of Urion and Jocelyn. His purple tabard, adorned with the golden dome and crossed pikes of the royal house of North Calas, was so firmly ironed that it seemed to move independently of his body. Bowing as though a board were strapped to his back, he offered up a long purple velvet cushion, atop which rested a lavishly decorated golden scepter adorned with a dragon's head. Urion eyed the ostentatious gift. "I confess I have never seen its like," he commented diplomatically. "I suspect not," Cragmire gloated in return. "Our historians have traced its origins to a wealthy empire that existed before the split." Grisland stepped forward, eyes narrowed. "May I?" The king of North Calas could not conceal a measure of skepticism, but nodded his acquiescence. "I suppose you may, wizard. Keep in mind this heirloom has been in my family for generations, and has been studied by the most knowledgeable scholars in the kingdom." Grisland lifted the scepter gently from the pillow and inspected it closely. "This is older even than you have been told. It was crafted by a master during the Arcanic era, when the Brotherhood ruled as kings, before Father Alamon requested that we abdicate our thrones." The surprise revelation elicited a small chorus of impressed murmurs that the wizard did not even seem to notice, or chose not to notice, his focus so intense on the priceless artifact. Cragmire mumbled something that did not quite escape his well-kept salt-and-pepper beard, but the look in his eyes clearly said that he was questioning his decision to give away something of such unknown value. To take the gift back now would be unthinkable, however. Urion would likely accept a simple apology and a substitution, but rumors of such a decision by North Calas's ruler would quickly spread to every corner of the civilized world, causing irreparable damage to his reputation. "Something is hidden here." After a moment of even more heightened concentration by Grisland, the dragon head at the tip of the scepter suddenly sprung apart into 4 separate pieces, still seemingly attached but not connected by any visible means. Everyone except the wizard took an unconscious step back in confusion. There were gasps from the nearby crowd, which turned into ahs and even shouts of alarm when the separated headpieces began to whirl in a circle. "Curious," Grisland remarked with an unmistakable note of excitement in his rich bass voice. Reaching in carefully among the moving parts, he removed a small oval plaque that appeared to be formed of pure crystal or even diamond. Flowing gold script, flecked with tiny sparkles that glowed like hot coals, had somehow been embedded beneath the surface. The processes that must have been involved in its creation were unfathomable, and almost certainly not natural in the mortal definition. "The language is that once native to the eastern provinces of Sidion," he informed them. It has not been spoken except perhaps by certain scholars, so far as I know, since roughly 1,000 years before the creation of the split. It was considered a language of the masters, and so replaced by what would eventually become the common tongue, still spoken today. The masters meaning your kind, Cragmere blurted tactlessly. Yes, replied the wizard simply, refusing to be baited by the brash monarch. Well, can you translate it? I believe I can, if you will give me a moment. Yes, it is an inscription. To Maggie, the jewel of my heart, whose eyes are as the twinkling stars in the night sky of Irilenia, and whose tongue is as dragon's fire, or something like that. Maggie, Jocelyn wondered aloud. Could this have been a gift to Queen Margarine of Elrith, I wonder? Her island queendom was near the eastern coast of the mainland, or so I have read. Most astute, your majesty, replied Grisland. I suspect that this sceptre was gifted to the queen by our brother, Spirion, who was then the king of Susia. They were once in love, long ago. The relationship was, he hesitated a moment, tumultuous, to put it mildly. This belonged to the witch queen of the Isle? Asked Cragmere, as though the sceptre had suddenly morphed into a coiled viper. His repugnance was tempered slightly by the fact that he obviously no longer felt the slightest remorse at giving the ancient love token away. Some have called her that, Grisland replied stiffly, though her proper title was Mage Queen. This time Jaden was sure he detected a hint of irritation in his instructor's voice. You are bleeding, Jocelyn informed the wizard, pointing to his hand. Drops of blood were forming from a thin red line on his palm and slowly dripping from his index finger to pool together on the wooden surface of the platform. Yes, he replied unconcerned. The sceptre is designed so that it is impossible to miss all of the little razors hidden inside when removing the plaque. It is not uncommon for gifts between, he looked deliberately to Cragmere, my kind, to have some bite to them. The sensation of physical pain strengthens the memory of a momentous occasion, such as an anniversary or simply the reception of such a lavish gift. It also imprints the seriousness of our intentions. I believe he loved her very much at one time. Wizards have a strange notion of affection, Cragmere scoffed. It causes no permanent damage to one of my kind. Our powers can be used to heal our own wounds as readily as another's, or as easily as it can be used to cause harm. The implied threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Urion quickly filled the silence. I think I speak for every man who has loved a woman when I say that love can carry a bite, he said with a mischievous glance to the queen. Jocelyn eyed him darkly. If you would care to elaborate on that line of thinking, my love, we may discover whose tongue is more like dragon's fire, the Queen of Elrith or the Queen of Crysin. The look was for show, Jaden knew. His mother and father were deft partners in diplomacy, and both aware that male chauvinism was comfortable ground for their distinguished guest. Cragmere chuckled, effectively distracted from his conversation with the uncharacteristically prickly wizard. My father once said that if he could forge a weapon as sharp as a woman's tongue, he could retake the South. The man chortled at his own comment while Crysin's royal couple laughed along politely for his benefit. Only those who knew the queen extremely well would have noticed the tension at the sides of her eyes that said Urion's ruse would come with a price yet to be determined. Shifting his attention back to Jaden, Cragmire smiled. Carolel insisted that you join her in her coach as we continue to the castle, he confided suggestively. Come, Urion announced with more enthusiasm than he likely felt. A great feast awaits in the royal dining hall. Our friend deserves a proper reception, with Eridan's finest entertainment, food, and plenty of chilled mead. General Eckenroy clapped his hands together forcefully, and the royal guard pivoted in seamless unity to escort the procession onward. Cragmere's horse shied beneath him at the sound, and the king shot his ex-knight a look that made Jaden wonder if a dagger was the wisest gift to bestow on the man. The thought was only a distraction, though, he knew, from the cause of the lump that had been steadily swelling in his throat since Cragmere had sized him up and mentioned wooing. The king's words had not been a promising prelude to his interactions with the princess. Unprepared to be alone with her so soon, it was with a growing sense of dread that he approached the coach with what felt like the entire world watching. He stopped briefly before the heavily lacquered door, took a breath, and nodded for the waiting footman to knock. Carolel did not open the door herself, but instead the latest in a long line of unlucky handmaidens handled the tedious duty for her. This girl was much like the princess's previous handmaidens, who Jaden had met in Garban, not quite as pretty as Carolel, which was very important, and trained to scowl at everyone she saw. "Oh, it's you," the girl said with a distasteful twist to her mouth, as though an unsavory stray dog had wandered up to the coach and was begging for scraps. "I suppose you think you can just hop aboard with the princess? Is that how young men behave in this kingdom?" "Now, Charlene, we mustn't be rude," followed a voice like a benevolent nightingale. "Even though we are in," she cut off with obvious deliberation, "not in Garban. We, at least, must maintain a measure of civility. Tell Lord Ryanthorn he may board my carriage if his intentions are genteel." Charlene backed out of the way with an impressive impression of a disappointed sigh, then muttered something incomprehensible, which Jaden took as his cue to enter. Gathering his resolve, he climbed the single step and peered inside. A layer of thin red satin curtains lined the inside of a layer of thin blue ones, so that the warm light inside the coach was more flattering to the skin of the occupant. Carolel was seated on the upholstered bench to the right, poised so that Jaden could take in the full effect of her as soon as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. Her hair was woven neatly atop her head, with blonde curls hanging down in perfect little ringlets. The light blue dress she wore accentuated her eyes perfectly. She was striking. "Do you like it?" she asked. He raised his eyebrows in genuine confusion. "The dress, Jaden," she said as if he should have known exactly what she was talking about. "Women in the East have them cut this way to wear only once, on their wedding night. Then they burn them. It is all the rage at court. The imported silk costs a small kingdom, but I think it is more than worth it. Don't you?" He nodded dumbly. It looked to him like most of the other dresses he had seen her wear, perhaps lower cut with a few more frills, but other than that, it did have a translucent sort of shimmer, he supposed, suggesting the form of the wearer beneath. His cheeks began to burn the more he thought about it. "Sit down and close your mouth," she told him with a secretive smile that eerily mimicked her father's. "There will be plenty of time to ogle me later. We will be stuck here for a week, so I am told. I am sure you can afford to commission an artist to paint me as I am now, if you so choose." He sat across from her as the coach started slowly forward. Charlene sat to his left, the well-trained handmaiden's disapproving eyes never leaving him. It was not her fault, he knew. Carolel probably instructed her to be as rude as possible so that she herself seemed kind in comparison. "You look well," the princess complimented him. He almost thanked her, then suddenly remembered to whom he was speaking. If she was offering him a compliment, she was likely setting him up to knock him back down. It was the same game she had played with him since they were children. The best defense he had found was to continually change the subject from one mundane topic to the next until she grew bored. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it had saved him on more than one occasion. "It was hot this summer," he said mechanically. "Was it hot in Garban?" Her expression was unreadable. Neither pair of eyes had left him since he had entered the carriage. It was an effort not to squirm under their penetrating gazes, and the constant barrage was certain to get to him eventually. He wished the coach would move faster. "What do you think, Charlene? His shoulders have filled out nicely. He has his father's sturdy frame. Am I mistaken, or does the prince appear to have finally reached manhood?" Charlene snickered predictably. "The knights in your father's court would eat him alive," she replied. "Perhaps. I have heard that General Eckenroy, as they call him here, has overseen his training. You would think that after a man has embarrassed himself by being forcibly removed from such an austere order as the knighthood, he would not shame himself further by accepting some peculiar foreign post. King Urion must have a soft spot in his heart for unwanted cast-offs." Jaden bit his tongue. He had known the general for the majority of his life. However Eckenroy had departed Cragmare's service, he highly doubted it was anyone's decision but his own. "Still, I think he would account himself well with my father's knights. He will be old enough to compete in the games next season. What do you think, Jaden?" she asked him directly. "Could you stand toe-to-toe with my father's knights on the tournament grounds?" "I hope your Highness finds our city to your liking," he said blandly. "The people are excited by your visit. We do not receive many princesses around these parts." Charlene shook her head. "This one has a long way to go until he reaches manhood, if you ask me." "A most impressive observation," Carolel complimented her. "Thank you, Highness," the girl said, beaming. "Tell the driver to stop. You can walk with the other servants now." Charlene looked stricken. "Did I say something wrong?" she asked in unfeigned surprise, dropping the mask of confidence altogether. Apparently, she had not yet learned everything she needed to know about the princess. If the poor girl was still seeking approval, she had a heartbreaking road ahead of her. Since Carolel's tactics were not working on her initial target, she had instead turned on her handmaiden, accepting the smaller victory. Unless she had planned this all along, she was certainly capable of such in-depth manipulation. Pulling open the small sliding window that allowed the coach's occupants to communicate with the driver, Charlene shouted for the man to draw rein. The fellow looked back oddly, but heeded her words and brought the horses to a halt. "Your Highnesses?" she excused herself, nearly in tears as she scrambled down from the coach. Carolel watched her go with a smirk, until the door shut and the coach gently lurched forward again. "Come sit by me," she ordered him as soon as they were alone. "Servants are so tedious when one is trying to have a sophisticated battle of wills." He gave her his best vacant expression, as though he had no clue to what she was referring. "You cannot shut me out this entire trip, Jaden, however hard you try. Everyone knows that the Prince of Crysin is no dimwit." Reluctantly, he changed seats, sitting as far from her as he could on the short, cushioned bench. A faint whiff of perfume tickled his nose, the alluring fragrance causing the hair on his arm to rise. The complex blend of scents probably cost more than the average commoner earned in a year. "At some point you will let your guard down, and I will get inside," she continued. "No man can resist me for long, let alone a boy who has not yet learned to control his emotions." "There will be a feast tonight in honor of the great victory at the Split," he said in response. "I do hope they have duck at the feast. Duck is my favorite." "You have matured," she murmured, seeming to enjoy the commitment he showed to his tactic. "The Jaden I knew would have already thrown a tantrum and invented some ridiculous reason to excuse himself." Leaning close, she whispered in his ear, "I know you think I am simply dreadful, but I too have grown since our last meeting." Her breath was hot, causing him to swallow hard. "If you are a good plaything, I will reward you with more than you bargained for." It was going to be a long week.